Welcome to the Health Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host. My special guest today is Dr. Alan Goldhamer. Dr. Goldhamer is the founder and director of the TrueNorth Health Center in Santa Rosa, California. He's a trained chiropractic physician. He's on the adjunct faculty of the School of Naturopathic Medicine at Bastyr. He's lectured at many chiropractic colleges, written many articles, including a brilliant book called The Pleasure Trap. And Dr. Goldhamer is truly one of the leading experts in the entire field of water-only fasting. So I'm so pleased and happy to have my good friend and colleague on here today. Welcome, Alan. Hi. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Glad to be here.
Yes. I want to get into something. You know, the NHA has a long history of being really at the vanguard of water-only fasting. I mean, the original founders going back 75 years ago when it was the American Natural Hygiene Society, you know, they were very well entrenched in the work of fasting, and it's amazing. And so this organization probably is the leading link for that. There are many health organizations, but none that really stand for that kind of work. What I want to ask you is because I'd like to get into what was your motivation early on in your career to go into fasting care. And there is something called time binding where we get to stand on the shoulders of people that have gone before. And in your apprenticeship, you of course trained with one of the great docs, Dr. Alec Burton. I'm just curious as to what motivated you for fasting, and how did the work with Dr. Burton inform your ongoing work in the field?
Well, my first interest really came from reading Herbert Shelton. And, Herbert Shelton had this idea that health kind of resulted from healthful living. It had to do with how you lived, diet, lifestyle issues. And that's, made a lot of sense to me. It was very intellectually appealing. At the time, I was just a kid. I was trying to be a better basketball player than Doug Lyle. And, he kept beating me badly. And I thought maybe if I
by the way, he still is, by the way.
He still does. Yeah. Every time that I thought, it would give me an edge. And the problem is it didn't work because he adopted the same type of diet and lifestyle. And so to this day, he still destroys me. But it did get me very interested. I was also inspired by my uncle, who was a medical doctor, because he said that alternative medicine and thinking was the worst thing that you could do. He said, nobody in our family could go to a doctor like that, let alone become a doctor like that. And when I told him I wanted to go into that field, he said, better I should be a communist spy. And he was violently opposed to the idea. My father, on the other hand, who was a very serious guy, took me aside and he said, son, I don't know anything about this alternative medicine, but anything that makes him that mad and angry, it can't be bad. So stick to your guns and good luck to you.
So did he live long enough to see you come to fruition, or what?
He did. In fact, it was interesting because he was having TIAs and serious cognitive problems. He had to retire from teaching. Then I had just gone into practice. He came and he fasted for 26 days. He recovered his health. 20 years later, he helped edit The Pleasure Trap. So he ended up living a long life, having a good life, a good death. And, it worked out well for him. My mother, on the other hand, when she was 92, I really remember this. She said, Alan, all of my friends are dead. All 50 friends, they have all died. All the ones that used to make fun of her crazy son's diet and everything. And she said, you have to warn your patients. If they're going to eat and live like this, make younger friends. And she said, much younger, because 10 years isn't enough. You have to go, much younger.
So how did the experience with Dr. Burton inform what you did, or affect what you did?
Well, I met Dr. Burton at a National Health Association conference when I was about 16 or 17. I think I also met you at the same conference.
Yeah, we did. That's when you had your sprout business in the Northwest, I remember.
And I was thinking, well, this sounds pretty good. And I went up to Dr. Burton, and I remember saying, listen, I'd like to do the kind of work you're doing. And he kind of patted me on the head and he said, well, that's nice. And you become a doctor and then let me know. And so 7 years later, I went up back to him at another national health conference and I said, I'm ready. And he said, ready for what? And I said, I'm ready for you to train me to do this kind of work. And he says, who are you? And I said, I'm the guy that you promised 7 years ago, if I went to school and did this training, that you would train me. And he said, I did. He says, I have to ask the boss. And he went and we talked with Nejla, and he agreed. And I think I was his first intern there. And so got a chance to go to Australia and see people getting well. And it was really quite remarkable how consistent and predictable the outcome was. It was very inspiring. And he showed me the protocols that he used for fasting. He warned me about the mistakes he had made as a young man, where there were bad outcomes because of his own ignorance, and suggested that I not have to learn those mistakes the hard way.
Yeah, it's interesting how exciting it is when you actually see people get well, which is something that so many people in the medical profession don't get to see. I mean, it's just...
I would write to my uncle, the medical doctor, and I'd say, I'm seeing these patients with blood pressure. They're getting well. And he says, no, they're not. I said, Uncle, I'm taking their blood pressure. I'm telling you, they're getting better. He goes, you don't know how to take blood pressure. I've been in practice for 50 years. They never get better. He refused to look at our data from our first study. He said he wouldn't look at the data until it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. 2 months before it came out in a peer-reviewed journal, he died of a massive cardiac arrest. My mother swore that he died just so he wouldn't have to admit he was wrong. Me, I think he died from all the K foods, the kugel, the kreplach, the knishes, the blintzes. We'll never know for sure.
Ethnic bliss, yes, ethnic bliss. Right. Let's get into water only fasting a little bit, because I'm a little disturbed. I don't know if you are, to see all of this misinformation, for example, online, and I keep finding people that go on these unbelievably extended periods of fasting without really any sense to how they're approaching it. And as you and I know, there's a standard of care that we kind of adhere to, because we've learned through the years that this is something not to trifle with. I mean, many times nothing goes wrong, but something can happen. And so talk a little bit about what that standard of care is, and why things like excessive overexertion during the fast is not a good idea. You have people advocating incredible exercise during water fasting. So speak to that just a bit.
So, fasting requires certain things. The first thing is to make sure the person's actually a good candidate for fasting. Some people, fasting would be counterproductive and could be life and limb threatening. So you don't want the wrong people to fast. And the way you determine if a person's a good candidate for fasting is very simple. It's a medical history, a physical exam, and basic laboratory testing. So no matter who's fasting, where you're fasting, how you're fasting, there always has to be history, exam, and lab done in order to be able to not only rule out people that shouldn't fast, but to provide a baseline of data so that you can monitor a fast and determine the difference between a really positive thing and a negative thing. They look the same sometimes. These healing crises can look similar to problems, but you want to differentiate. If you don't differentiate, either fasts are terminated inappropriately, unnecessarily, or people are allowed to continue to fast to the point where they damage their body or compromise their health and well-being. So history, exam, and lab is necessary for everybody. Once you've determined that a person is a good candidate for fasting, fasting has to be done properly. For example, if you're too active in fasting, what happens is they say, well, if I'm more active, I'll lose more weight. Yes, you will lose more weight, but it won't be more fat. It'll be muscle. You'll force the process of gluconeogenesis to break down the protein to maintain the glucose that's necessary for muscle or brain activity. The largest human source of glucose burning is the brain. And next is muscles. And so if you push the body to produce more glucose than it can have available in a fasting state, the only way it gets that extra glucose consistently is from breakdown of muscle. So if you're trying to not break down your lean tissue, you want to rest during fasting. It's counterintuitive, but the way to maximize fat loss, and in particular, a type of fat associated with ill health, which is visceral fat, the type of fat associated with the production of the inflammatory markers, you want to rest when you fast. And we've done a study recently that people can view at fasting.org, where they look at what happens to the body in fasting using a DEXA scanner to very carefully analyze the difference between fat and visceral fat, muscle, lean tissue, fiber, water, and glycogen. And what we found was simply that if you take a person and you fast them, they lose water, fiber, glycogen, protein, and fat. And after they're done fasting, they regain water, fiber, glycogen, and protein, but not fat if they're eating properly. And so what ends up happening is when you look at the body composition of a human 6 weeks after they've finished fasting, if they do it properly, their lean tissue is actually higher than it was at baseline. Bone mass is the same, and it's fat loss that continues, including during the recovery period. Fat continues to come off, and preferentially visceral fat. In fact, the ratio of visceral fat to adipose tissue is almost 3-to-1. It's the highest proportional ratio of visceral fat to adipose tissue that I've seen, higher than, say, going on some dead Dr. Atkins diet or whatever. Right. So the bottom line is, if you want to maximize fat, you want to maximize rest. Fat loss, you want to maximize rest. And that's why we encourage resting when people are fasting. And that's one of the mistakes people make, is they're too active. And that makes them vulnerable to things like dehydration. There's a natural physiological dehydration that occurs in fasting, but it's accentuated if you're not controlling the environment which the faster is fasting in. And dehydration is actually one of the things that can lead to the kidney problems, the cardiac problems, the pain problems, et cetera.
Address the other side of that, because many times they feel like they have to guzzle ungodly amounts of water on the other side of that, which creates other issues.
And that's
lower sodium content.
And taking in more water, what happens is you can flush out your electrolytes, your sodium, your calcium, your potassium, and that can lead to cardiac challenges and other problems. So too much water.
These are the issues why I tell people, if you're going to do any kind of extended fast, you really should do it under supervision. You should really do it with someone who has the knowledge and the insight of how to monitor those fasts. People don't realize how much monitoring is actually really done when people fast. And so they think that, oh my God, I can just go on this fasting site on Instagram and then they'll be like, I've got a big flank pain, and anybody have any idea? It's like, well, so it's really kind of devastating.
And it's also interpreting that data in as a picture as a whole. No one individual measurement necessarily is the end all be all. For example, somebody may get a blood test back and see that their potassium is very high and assume that means their potassium is high. It may be that when the blood was drawn, there was crenation and breakdown of the cells that's released potassium. It may not reflect what's actually happening in the body. If you're not used to looking at lab and fasting, you can easily be fooled by some of these incidental findings that occur because of the way, say, for example, blood is processed, or if it sits around too long, or, et cetera. There's so many examples where you've got to be careful not to let the laboratory findings mislead you. And you take the lab in context to the clinical picture, what you're looking at. And when the lab looks wrong, it's often because the lab data is wrong. But if you don't know that, it's really easy to make assumptions that turn out to be counterproductive.
We're speaking with Dr. Alan Goldhamer on fasting, water-only fasting. We're going to take just a few moments and come back to have a few words from our wonderful sponsor, the National Health Association. And now, to put a smile on the sponsors of the National Health Association, you're listening to the Health Science Podcast Show. I want to remind you to visit the National Health Association website, where you'll find incredible resources to support your healthy lifestyle, including plant-exclusive eating without added salt, oil, and sugar. Simply go to healthscience.org or nationalhealthassociation.org. Be sure to check out membership, which is $35 per year for those living within the U.S. and $55 for those living outside the U.S. You'll be amazed at all the information and benefits you'll receive. As a member, you're kept up to date on the latest evidence-based tools for health promotion. You'll receive the incomparable quarterly magazine, Health Science, a beautiful 40-page advertising-free publication mailed to your home or offices, loaded with articles, recipes, inspirational stories, and interviews with world leaders in the fields of personal health, plant-based nutrition, water-only fasting, animal rights, and environmental support. And you'll receive details about life-changing events, such as the 2023 NHA Conference set for June 23 to the 25th, 2023 in Cleveland, Ohio, which will be the NHA's 75th annual NHA conference. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now back to the show. Yeah, I think it's one of the things that's been most impressive about what you've done, and we've been colleagues and friends for over 35 years, is that there's been so much incredible anecdotal evidence for benefits of fasting, and we know that in a wide range of conditions, everything from autoimmune diseases to whatever, inflammatory changes, on and on, arthritis, asthma, all kinds of things. But you took the next step of realizing how significant it is to push the evidence base and really gather the information that really needs. You know, in science, they have a phrase, publish or perish, and things get kind of lost. But whenever you're going to do studies that are going to kind of link a therapeutic intervention or a process like fasting with an outcome, two things become very important. Number one, is it safe? And number two, does it work? So safety and efficacy are always the foundation of how you're going to approach this. So I'd like you to speak to the ways that you've addressed those and the papers, both the early and the follow-up papers related to hypertension, why you chose that, why you decided to go in that direction, and even the early studies on safety, which were very important because, you know, the medical profession, you have so many so-called professionals that like to attack fasting on issues of safety. And so just address that if you can.
Well, you know, the safety study, we did the first and the only really large fasting safety study. And it was in large part because our colleague, Stefan Esser, wouldn't leave me alone until we kind of did that. And he was here as an intern during his medical training. And he said, look, you know, we really, more than anything, we need a fasting safety study because no human subject committee is going to approve this unless we have documentation that it can be done safely and it can be efficient. So we collected every subject's adverse events for 5 years and manually processed, you know, so every symptom was assigned a category 1 through 5 CATE criteria. And we eventually did publish a major paper on fasting safety in humans. And we found that, in fact, fasting, when it's done properly, is safe. And also we demonstrated that even age, you know, at that time up to 65, over 65, you couldn't get anybody to approve. We actually showed that there was no significant difference between a person 65 and 75 in terms of fasting safety. And so now anybody using that criteria should be able to get approval to evaluate fasting safety. So it was a really kind of a Herculean effort because we didn't have the computerization back then. It all had to be done manually. And so there was lots and hundreds of hours of doctor's labor put in to document this, but we did get it done. Now, since then, we've reproduced that data, but now it's all computerized. So it took just a few minutes, and it turns out they correlated very well. So, I mean, it speaks well to the reliability of the fact that there are no category 5 events, i.e. death. There's extremely rare category 4 events, all easily resolved with proper monitoring. They involve hyponatremia, so low white counts, low sodium levels. That's about all we've seen so far, which has been good in those evaluations. The category 3 events, most of them are hypertensive crises. According to these standards, anytime a systolic blood pressure measures over 160, it's a reportable event. So if a person comes in with blood pressure, say 220, and it goes down to 200, and then 190, and then 180, and then 170, every one of those is a reportable adverse event, even though clearly the trend is positive. In fact, 95% of those are established hypertensive patients who are resolving their issues. So what we found was that most of the category 1 and 2 adverse events are all the known expected symptoms you expect to see with fasting: the nausea, the low back pain, the headache, irritability, the hives, the different things that the body goes through in the process of getting well. And the conclusion of the study was if this protocol is used, that is history exam lab monitoring, then this process can be considered safe, and it is. And so the other thing we did once we got our director of research, Tasha Myers, who's our PhD postdoc from Columbia, to join our staff, we actually formed our own IRB, Human Subjects Committee, with federal-wide assurance. And now we have an IRB with federal-wide assurance populated by people that are actually knowledgeable about fasting, which is helpful because they don't freak out thinking that everybody that fasts is probably going to die. The truth is, most people think if you flew all the way from New York to California, you would die over Colorado from starvation unless you eat the pretzels. They think the pretzels save their life. That's what the truth is. And now we have an IRB where people are knowledgeable and can be, more objective in ensuring the safety of study participants.
Yeah, we're speaking with Dr. Alan Goldhamer, and at this point, I'd like to let you tell people how they can follow you or get in touch with you or find you, and what would be a website or a location where they can kind of zero in on where you are and what you're doing.
Well, there's two websites. One is the Foundation's nonprofit research-based fasting compendium website, which is fasting.org. And fasting.org is a chance for us to look not only at our research, but other people's research. And it also has the ability to search the research, including that data before 1976 or whatever it is that they started with the computer searching. We've got manual searched hundreds of articles that have been downloaded and are available so that you can actually search the literature on fasting through that website. It's also where we post all our studies. As our studies become available, we post them on that website. We also have TrueNorthHealth.com, which is the center's website, which also has our articles, but it also has access to video clips and a learning channel. And we live stream our lectures at the center so people can freely access that. And we also have all the information about participating in fasting through TrueNorth Health Center, which is actually a really interesting process because we offer a free phone conversation with me. If a person goes online, completes the registration forms, I review their medical history, and I'm happy to talk to them without cost on the phone to determine, is fasting something you might want to consider, try to refer them to the place that might be most appropriate for them to do that. We also have an active telemedicine practice where our doctors are available to people remotely so that they can provide education, or they can have access to a doctor that's not an idiot with, easily, and through Zoom or through one of these online mechanisms. So now all of those are available for people that didn't used to be, but are now freely available through TrueNorthHealth.com.
Well, to take that, let's move past that safety issue that you talked about, and let's segue into what made you focus on the hypertensive studies, the early and follow-up data, which was really, really landmark studies with fasting. Absolutely.
Yeah, we did a study that was, our first paper was published with our colleague T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University, who was so helpful in helping us do this study where we took 174 consecutive patients with hypertension, found that 174 of those people, of the 174, were able to lower their pressure enough to eliminate medications. We had the largest effect size ever shown in treating hypertension in humans, with an average effect size of over 60 points in stage 3 hypertension. The results were fabulous. And what's interesting is we've recently done some additional studies prospectively, along with our colleagues from the Mayo Clinic. And what we found is the numbers are absolutely correlating with what we originally found in the retrospective analysis in terms of the magnitude of effect. And so now we have that same type of evaluation done, but on a modern prospective study. And what's interesting, we have 6-week follow-up, and now this year we'll be publishing a paper with 1-year follow-up. And now for the first time, we're able to show not only can people get well when they're fasting, not only can they stay well at 6-week follow-up, but now we were able to show that the majority of patients are able to maintain changes a year later and still have normal blood pressure, be medication-free, and having maintained weight loss. And I just want to point out that Dr. Lyle had actually predicted that only about 5% of people would be able to show long-term follow-up. And the number is almost 10 times that. So he was more wrong than I was in terms of predicting how.
So the compliance was pretty amazing, actually.
Now he's trying to backtrack a little bit. Now he's saying his 5% was the population as a whole, and that we have a highly self-selected population, which is true. People willing to, fast. And so maybe that's why we're seeing such better and more impressive numbers than what he had.
Look, we know that there's incredible benefits even in relationship to autoimmune disease, but what comes up a lot for people is the potential impact of fasting on cancer. I want to just touch on that briefly because I know you've had these isolated cases that you published on lymphoma. Yeah. And speak to that just a little bit, because this is something of great interest to people.
We chose lymphoma to discuss because it's one of the few cancers that was not considered unethical behavior to, get well.
Right.
Because the problem is the medical management for lymphoma is very limited. It doesn't affect all-cause mortality. There's some real serious limitations. So watchful waiting is not uncommonly recommended for patients that have this type of cancer. About 10% will go through periods of remission. with or without chemotherapy, but it tends to recur. So what we did is we had the first subject that we got was a good candidate. She was a stage 3 follicular lymphoma patient, 42 years old. We brought her in, we put her through, she'd been well worked up and excisional biopsy, the whole bit. We put her through fasting. Her tumors disappeared. In 3 weeks, they just disappeared. And so we followed this woman at 2 months, at 6 months, at a year. By the time we were at a year, there was no palpable lesions left. She was doing very well clinically. We decided that we would publish this case report to let people know that there was another way of thinking about it, looking at it. We wrote a paper for BMJ, the British Medical Journal Case Reports, and after quite a bit of back and forth, it finally did get published. But the comments were, well, maybe she just got lucky because, people can sometimes spontaneously remit. And then, so they invited us to follow her for 3 years to see whether or not it stayed in remission or like typical in lymphoma would recur. Well, after 3 years, whole body CT, long story short, she was cancer-free. And so then we continue to track this patient. We now have a 6-year follow-up on her. She continues to be cancer-free. She's maintained a whole plant food SOS-free diet. And now since we published that paper, or had that paper published, I should say, we've been seeing lots of lymphoma patients, including recently, I just last week talked to a gentleman who was a stage 4 lymphoma with mets into the bone. And he's done very well. His oncologist, who was very antagonistic at first, is now telling him he needs to do another round of fasting because he's done quite well. Everything has either stayed the same or improved. He's done and fabulous clinically, and we expect he'll hopefully continue to go into full remission. What was interesting, though, when I submitted that 3-year follow-up to BMJ, do you know it was rejected? The paper was rejected because one of the new reviewers said, oh, they probably just got lucky. We protested, we appealed it, and they did end up publishing the 3-year follow-up.
Well, is that just because the sample size was too small for them?
Well, it's just an N of 1.
It's an N of 1, so,
And it's easier to believe that they got lucky than to think that fasting and diet might have to do something. But the point is, now we've got a number of these cases that we're putting together into a cohort. And once we get that cohort published, we believe it'll justify a clinical trial. And we have a relationship that we're working with one of the large HMOs that this next year we're going to be doing clinical control trial in the treatment with random assignment and crossover on hypertension. And if that's successful, we believe that we can leverage them into doing one on lymphoma. So in the next couple of years, we're hoping to be able to do a prospective study with random assignment, cross them over, and treat both hypertension and lymphoma using this methodology.
It's interesting. One of the hallmark processes that happens in a fast, you and I know, is the process of autophagy, which is really a deep house cleaning process that the cell can go through when it's deprived of more concentrated nutrients. So it shifts into repair and housekeeping, so to speak. It's interesting when you look at data related to autophagy, they make a strong case that it will prevent primary cancer development and growth, but there's some data suggesting that it may enhance metastasis over time. So it's kind of, what's your take on that? What do you feel about that kind of evaluation and data?
Yeah, I think there are some errors of attribution going on there. It's true that autophagy has become very popular since 2016 with Yoshinori Yoshimi, who gets the Nobel Prize in Medicine for...
And which he deserves. It's an amazing set of experiments, actually.
And, I think there's a problem because part of the healing process in the body is associated with inflammation. And inflammation itself is responsible for cardiovascular disease and all kinds of problems.
And the beginning of cancer, by the way, too. You have to have an inflammatory process to seed the cancer.
Absolutely. So, but I'm thinking what's happening here is, you go on a fast and the body produces an acute response. We know clinically is associated with a healing response. And I think what's happening is you're getting some misinterpretation of an active healing process being misinterpreted as a pathological process. Because what we're seeing clinically is overall inflammatory tendencies improve dramatically. And the markers of inflammation, the IL-6, the TNF-alpha, the
all
CRP,
the cytokines
overall,
they drop. Yeah.
Go down, but they often go up initially after fasting. For example, we did a study with HOMO-IR, thinking that, because fasting improves diabetes so much that you would expect HOMO-IR to improve, but it doesn't. It actually is higher at the end of fasting. But if you follow those patients at 6 weeks post-fasting, which we've just done, it turns out it's dramatically better than at baseline. But there's a healing wave that's occurring, and I'm assuming that that's what we're going to find out is actually happening with fasting.
And to speak to that wave, as you know, in the early stages of the fast with autoimmune, you see a plummet of those cytokines often. Like CRP will go down through the ground. It could be
But
up.
it does sometimes go up.
And then it can go up and it'll plummet.
Exactly.
It goes through that kind of, you're riding a wave with those cytokines and those acute phase proteins. So I think that's a fascinating area, that whole autophagic situation that goes on with cancer. And I think we're going to unravel that more and more. Another thing that I'd love you to speak to, because it comes up a lot, as you well know, there's such a major concern with the microbiota these days. So much interest in the environment of the gut and the teeming trillions of organisms that play a major role in everything from digestion to immune support. There's always this, it seems to be there's a little bit of a hole that needs to be filled in terms of research. The early stages of fasting and the impact on that diversity and over long periods. Can you speak to that in any way?
Yeah,
any data that you've gathered?
We've done the first study with Luigi Fontana from Washington University looking at long-term fasting's effect on the microbiome, the diversity. We know that, or we think that in a healthy individual, particularly on a plant-based diet, they'll have 1,000 strain or more of bacteria and maybe 5 pounds of creatures. I mean, these are living organisms swimming around in your intestinal tract, eating, drinking, and defecating inside you. So what they poo in you could be toxic waste like TMA that becomes trimethylamine oxidase and it's thought to be tied with colon cancer and all kinds of problems. They could be vitamin K and other nutrients and essential protective components. Right. And what determines what your microbiome is pooing in you largely is going to be affected by what you feed them. And that's why meat eaters have a completely different flora on average than, say, plant eaters. You get big changes. And also why things like sodium and sugar and oil may have a detrimental effect on the environment and harboring less favorable balances of the organisms. What we don't know yet is exactly how to interpret all of that. And one of the problems is the data that we've collected on fasting, it hasn't even been published yet because it's very complicated and challenging to make sense of exactly what it is we think we're seeing here.
Well, you know, the interesting thing with that is that we know that the major nutrient supply for that is actually fiber in the plant exclusive diet. And so when that's given, those organisms can ferment that fiber into short chain fatty acids and create the mucus lining of the gut and all of that. So I guess the question comes up, if you're taking away all of that fiber in an extended period of time, how are you affecting the integrity of those organisms that are needing that to ferment, to feed themselves? So that's a great question.
What we think is happening in fasting is that there's a big die-off in general. It's like rebooting the hard drive in a computer that's become corrupted. You know, you turn the computer off, you don't know why, but when you turn it back on, it starts working better. And I think it's a fair analogy that when you go on a fast, there's a big shift, a big change. And then if you give the right prebiotics, that is the right diet after fasting, the body's able to rebuild its diverse microflora balance. And the reason I say that we suspect that's true is because of what we see clinically. The patients with the irritable bowel, the ulcerative colitis, all these gut-related problems seem to do consistently and predictably improve clinically. And it's likely that's what we're going to find out. But the data isn't there yet to be able to point with certainty exactly what those changes are taking place and exactly.
Well, the other side of that coin is those inflammatory problems, because we know fasting has such a profound impact on reducing inflammation. Those outcomes could be inflammatory related specifically and not necessarily, microbiome or microbiota related. So, but so let's
we're speculating. We're speculating right now.
No, I understand
see this
that.
Clinical outcome, and later the data sometimes explains why it is what we do works. In fact, that's true for much of natural hygiene. Is that they're doing the same things that these guys have been doing for 100 plus years. It's just now we're better able to explain why doing that seems to be helpful.
Right. Let's talk about the really one of the more critical things related to fasting, and then it'll lead us into whole food nutrition, and that is the process of refeeding. I encountered recently some very disturbing data where people, and these are physicians too, who, because there is this ketogenesis in fasting, we know fat's being broken down, we know that's being used for energy demands of the body, trying to continue with the autophagy and ketogenesis, they were actually recommending immediate keto diets following long extended periods of fasting. Just address how dangerous that really is and how important the refeeding phase is, from refeeding syndromes to whatever else can occur.
Yeah. Well, going on a high protein, high fat diet after fasting is just nuts. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire and wondering why the flames turn up. But I think that's just arrogance exceeding ignorance. It's people just not really even thinking through what they're trying to do physiologically. And I also want to mention, you hear now a lot about dry fasting, where people advocate not drinking water. So there's no solute to put the toxins that are mobilized in, and then it leads to dehydration. And ultimately, and unfortunately, it's led to the death of some of the advocates. But, it's just not physiologically sound. But it doesn't keep people from advocating it, even though it's not like there's data supporting or even logical thinking supporting it. And the same thing's true with these high protein, high fat diets. What's good for short-term symptomatic weight loss or something isn't necessarily something that's sustainable long-term. Honestly, if you just want to lose a lot of weight, just cut your thigh off at the hip with a chainsaw. It's 40 pounds overnight. I mean, they've got great prosthetics now. So I guess if weight loss is the only goal, there's probably even better ways than that. But I wouldn't recommend any of it.
Well, we know that in a typical lifestyle, the amount of time that you're going to fast is a very small part of your life. And a big part is going to be what you eat. So the evolution into the plant.
I don't know if that's completely true if you include intermittent fasting in that, because we advocate people fast 16 hours each and every day. So they're actually fasting 2/3 of the time, only eating 1/3 of the time.
Well, we can argue that that's not necessarily a fast, as you know. It's a time-restricted pattern of eating, but let's suppose that is anyway. But as a rule, they're going to be eating a lot more than when they're fasting, right? But the bottom line then is so that their food intake becomes really critical. And you're one of the people that was a leading proponent of not only plant exclusive eating, but now removing salt, oil, and sugar. And that was emphasized through even your work in the pleasure trap, why that was so important to do to break that cycle of that brain reward cascade that drives the overconsumption of hyperpalatable foods. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
I can. In fact, we coined the term SOS free because we wanted to acknowledge that just being on a vegan diet didn't necessarily mean it was a healthy diet.
Right.
The vegan diet has no animal food, meat, fish, veggies, and dairy products, but it could be Coca-Cola, or I should say soda pop and French fries and potato chips.
Oreo cookies is the classic vegan.
Oreo cookies can be vegan, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily healthy. Right. And so if you eliminate the chemicals that are added to the feed, that stimulate the dopamine in the brain, that leads to the pleasure, that sets up the pleasure trap, then you can end up with a healthy diet. So a vegan SOS-free diet or a whole plant food, salt, oil, and sugar-free diet. Salt, oil, and sugar are not food. They're hyper-concentrated food byproducts that are added to food that result in stimulation of dopamine in the brain. So you like the taste of it when it's there because your brain is being fooled. And as a consequence, it leads to the dietary pleasure trap. That's why people are fat, sick, and miserable. That's why we have metabolic syndrome so dominant. And that's why people are dying unnecessarily from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, even COVID-19. One of the big risk factors for dying from infectious disease is associated with metabolic syndrome, which is caused by the dietary pleasure trap. If you eliminate animal food, salt, oil, and sugar from the diet, what you're left with is a whole plant food SOS-free diet. Remember, SOS stands for the international symbol of danger, too, so it's easy to remember. SOS, salt, oil, and sugar.
Yeah, the dopamine brain reward cascade is kind of intriguing because people only think about it in relationship to the pleasure outcome. What they don't realize is that there are multiple dopamine pathways that are linked for personal and species survival. So not only do you get pleasure, but you trigger dopamine pathways for motivation. So you'll repeat the pleasure because you want to be, certainly when it comes to sex and food, that was essential for us to survive as a species and individually. So you're actually triggering multiple brain pathways that are locking this behavior, and your drive to go repeat this really dangerous hyperpalatability that is just setting you back and causing all kinds of problems.
Can you imagine if sexual behavior, for example, as an example, wasn't heavily reinforced? Do you think people would do all that huffing and puffing and sweating consistently enough to successfully reproduce? I don't think so.
No, not at all. So this has been a big step. And again, that's really caught on for a lot of people now. And I can definitely give you credit for being one of the first people to bring that to the surface because it was such an important shift of change.
I think it was very helpful in having a meme that was short and to the point, but brought home it was not just vegan, but also free of these added chemicals. I think that's a very important point.
With that being said, what's your feeling about bringing people into the fold with these faux foods whether they're these, alternative cheeses and meats and so on, which have plenty of salt, oil, and additives, which of course are not ideal, but they're moving the needle for people sometimes to get closer to being in a plant-based direction or a plant-exclusive direction, because no one wants to feel deprived. So initially in that transition, do you see a place for that, or you just are categorically opposed to that?
Well, I think, I've had this conversation with my colleague, John McDougall, quite a bit, because he's a little more flexible, because his argument is this.
Well, of course, with the salt that he adds to all his products, which is kind of interesting.
Well, but his argument is as follows. We need to save the planet.
Right.
In order to save the planet, we have to get people to adopt a vegan diet. That the animal husbandry, as we practice it today, is responsible for a bigger impact on global warming than the internal combustion engine. That there's, in order to save the planet, we have to get as many people eating vegan as possible. And even if that means they're not necessarily eating a healthy diet, at least it's a plant healthy diet, and in a sense, a planet healthy diet,
right?
Dominated by plants. And that if you talk to people about a vegan SOS-free diet, only a small percentage of highly motivated people are going to be willing to, work with it long enough to neuroadapt to it and be willing to adopt it. And so I would not disagree with him. And I'm perfectly happy.
I agree. You want to get people in the door. And I think sometimes getting them in the door gets you to move the needle in another direction. Right. So that's important.
But when it comes to working with my patients, I'm not here to save the world. I'm here to work with my patients.
Right.
According to my wife, I'm here only to do one thing, and that's prove I'm right and everybody else is wrong. But that's not really entirely true. But the idea is, for my patients, I want them not just to live to their full potential, but to not to spend the last 10 or 20 years of their life unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed, waiting for somebody to come and change their diaper because they've stroked out or had a heart attack or a stroke. And the best way to do that is to adopt a whole plant food SOS-free diet. So John McDougall is going to save the planet, and I appreciate that. I'm so glad he's going to do that. I'm only interested in saving my patients. And so I'm not going to tell them it's okay to eat greasy, fatty, processed vegan junk food when I know that the best way for them to avoid the debility that's going to face them in the last 10 or 20 years of their life is to adopt a whole plant food SOS-free diet. The fact that everybody in the world isn't interested in do that is fine. I'm only talking to my patients.
And your patients, in terms of that, have been pretty compliant with that, even in the face of...
We're showing now that at least the majority are able to maintain weight loss, blood pressure, and drug-free over a course of a year. That doesn't mean they're 100% compliant. It doesn't mean that they're not making some variations in their diet from what I might think is ideal. All we have to do is get them to do well enough that they can stay healthy enough that they're getting healthier faster than they're getting old. We just have to delay the premature facilitated aging so that they don't end up having unnecessary reversible preventable problems. So again, I don't know if you're going to be able to get everybody to do everything 100%. I don't know if you need to. But what I do know is that for some people, 100% compliance is a better goal than partial compliance, and here's why. Sometimes it's easier to do it all than it is to tease yourself. For example, if you have an alcoholic, you don't tell them, well, just drink beer and wine on the weekend and you'll be okay, because it doesn't work. The only thing that works for an alcoholic is to find a strategy to not drink. That's what works. However they do that.
So for you, abstinence makes the heart grow fonder, basically.
If you're an alcoholic, you don't say just have occasional. You say don't drink at all. And that's kind of radical, but we know from experience that works. Does that mean everybody has to be alcohol-free to avoid being a drunk? No, some people can occasionally have a drink and not become a drunk. But if you're a drunk, it's not you. So if you're a drunk, you need to not drink. Now, some people that are overweight don't want to face the fact that they're not able to regulate quantitative control of certain types of chemicals like oil, salt, and sugar. So if you're struggling with weight loss, you might find it easier to not eat any of that stuff than to occasionally tease yourself. If you're a person that can have a piece and you don't think about it, maybe you don't have to be as diligent. Although I would suggest, it's not just weight. The impact on the microbiome, for example, even small amounts of sugar and refined carbohydrate can alter the microbiome balance. And for people that have vulnerabilities there, a little bit might be a big deal, whereas other people, maybe it's not as big of a deal. So,
in the field of addiction is interesting because the definition that's used for actually describing addiction is the continued use of a substance or behavior without regard for negative consequence. So the key phrase there is negative consequence. So you can have a glass of wine, which would be considered possibly drug abuse, but not necessarily drug addiction, because it's not creating that outcome. So there's that line, there's that kind of continuum that's there. But you're right. For some people, your trigger. It may be you have a few little bit of this and you're off to the races. That's not going to work for you.
There's two problems, too, that we identify in our book, The Pleasure Trap. One is the pleasure trap, which is a little bit, you want a lot, it's hard to regulate quantity. Sometimes people don't regulate very well. They're better off not having any. But there's also something called the ego trap. And for the problem with those is people, if they can't have any, they feel deprived. They feel socially left out. It's a big one. And the problem is some people are vulnerable to the pleasure trap. Some people are vulnerable to the ego trap. And some people are vulnerable to both. And that's where the problem comes in. Because if you're sensitive to the pleasure trap and you can't have any, and that activates the ego trap, now you've got a problem. And so for those people, they don't have as high an adherence and compliance and long-term success as people that have one or the other.
And the other piece of this, too, is that people that have those connections to those foods, they don't realize that as they make improvements, their actual taste sensitivity changes, their desires change. And so that's a very big piece. And we know that's something that happens even through the fasting process.
Well, we've done that study.
I know you've done some data. I know you've gathered some data. Right.
You got it. We actually were able to detect minimum threshold to the sensitivity to salt and sugar, show it changed with fasting. And also the hedonic response, the likingness of salty, fatty, sweet fatty foods actually changes quickly with fasting and over long term with good adherence to the diet. The problem is if you keep teasing yourself, that transition may not be as efficient.
Right.
And so that may be a problem. It's easier to just get rid of all of it and then let your taste nerve adapt.
I love when people come out of a fast, they'll eat a piece of plain romaine lettuce and they'll wax philosophical. They'll wax philosophical for an hour.
Or they'll talk about how salty the chard is.
Yeah.
Because they think we put salt. It's the same salt that's always been there. They just couldn't taste it.
Between celery and chard, they're like over the top, So before we break, I want to just ask you about legacy, because, you've done a lot of work. Time's moving on for all of us. And I know there's so much research and work to be done. And you have been one of the people that has been the best training facility for physicians and people that want to really get this kind of information and move forward. What's your perspective of how things are moving with that? Is there more and more interest? Do you have hope for where this can go in the future with future researchers and people, as you see it, taking the ball and running with this? Where do you see this moving?
So what our plan has been, and what we're doing, is we founded the TrueNorth Health Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit research organization, to do two things. One was do primary research, try to figure out how to do fasting the most effectively, develop non-invasive biomarkers to determine who should fast, when they're done fasting, and then document it in peer-reviewed journals, as we've been doing, actually rather impressively, particularly in the last few years, what safety study, the biological changes that occur, what conditions respond to fasting, both in terms of clinical trials as well as case reports. And then we set up a teaching facility for doctors that wanted to learn to do something worthwhile with their life and go to heaven instead of hell, where they could come in and learn how to actually get people well, which is almost novel in terms of medicine, because as we know, if you're treating hypertensive patients or diabetics or the people that we're treating, they never get well under conventional care. They're told right from the get-go, you'll be on these drugs the rest of your life. You'll never get well.
They're on disease care management,
Absolutely.
Obviously.
Whereas these doctors come in and they say, my God, it's the first time I've ever seen somebody get well. It's an epiphany experience for many of them. It changes their perspective. So we have this residency training where doctors can come and train for a month, 3 months, or a year. And it's paid for by the foundation. We provide room and board and training. There's no cost to the doctors. And we want to continue that. And it's interesting that it's shifted from being primarily of interest from chiropractors and then naturopaths to now mostly medical doctors. So it's mostly the functional medicine doctors that have become disillusioned with the limitations of allopathic medicine and are looking to do something worthwhile with their life.
And the lifestyle medicine direction has caught up with the old hygienic information that goes back 75 years. So I'm glad everything's kind of catching up with each other, which is great.
It is. The one problem is they always want to intervene. And again, arrogance can exceed ignorance. So we're trying to bring some of the old hygiene philosophy through so that
it's hard to master the intelligent art of doing nothing, as Dr. Burton used to say, right? Before we break, is there any final words or advice you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, health results from healthful living. So you really got to be prepared to pay the price. And healthful living involves diet, sleep, and exercise. And I believe that limiting your feeding window to about 8 or 12 hours a day is probably a good general habit. And occasionally doing long-term fasting can really save your life.
I want to really thank Dr. Goldhamer for coming on with us today, sharing his words of wisdom and his time. And I urge you to go and follow up on his website and some of the places that he talked about previously. We're going to put those in the show notes too. And I especially want to thank the audience, the people out there. Without you, none of this could happen. I couldn't do what I do. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I would really like to thank all the people involved in this active community. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I truly look forward to seeing you on the next Health Science Podcast. Thank you so much. You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.